There we go. Continuing on test design, the subject of usage scenario tests comes up. Now, usage scenario tests is a broader subject than user story tests. They sound very similar because the user story tests are related to user stories, which is the interaction between a user and a system to get something done, and usage scenarios tests sound like they're the same thing. But usage scenario tests show up independent of how your requirements are structured or managed. And they can be designed and put together at any time in the life cycle and are not tied to any sort of agile process or methodology. So usage scenario test is a sort of more general purpose type of test, and they're pretty pragmatic and pretty useful in the software testing projects. When I look at prioritizing my tests, I find very often that usage scenario oriented tests bubble up to the top when prioritizing things. These are cross-functional tests, and if they yield a failure, if they do not pass, there's very often some actual job the user can't do with your software. So it becomes pretty important to make sure these tests are implemented effectively, really represent what users do, and basically show the programming team where there might be weaknesses in that area where users might not be able to succeed at doing their job. So usage scenario tests for me, very powerful, very important type of tests. Now, I like to start by asking, how do we uncover what the user really needs to do? And I start by saying, okay, let's look at software engineering. Let's look at modeling from a sort of different perspective. And let's reflect maybe on a historic thing that happened in January 20th, 1961, when the President of the United States, John Kennedy, made his inaugural address. And this was a very important speech. It was very motivational. It was influential and inspirational to a generation of people in America, but it spoke broadly to the whole world, not just to America. He's quoted as saying, "Ask not what your country can do for you, but ask what you can do for your country." So he said this with this beautiful Bostonian accent here. Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. And of course, if you read the whole speech, you'd see it's not just about American patriotism. He's diving into international cooperation and collaboration beyond borders. So that's pretty powerful stuff. So that's John Kennedy's inaugural address. Now, let's be inspired by that. And when we're looking at usage scenario-based testing, we should sort of paraphrase it respectfully. Ask not what our system does for our user, but ask what your user does with the system. When we're doing usage scenario-based testing, we're not modeling the software to figure out how to test it. We're actually modeling the user and how the user works and seeing if the user can do their job. So instead of diving in and studying formal requirements of the system, we should be diving in and looking at who are the users and what do they do with the system. And this is a beautiful thing. When we're looking at the usage of a system, get a sense for who are the users and what do they have to do. And then what we're going to demonstrate is, does the system let them do their job or their task or their work function, their process, their workflow? Can the user do what they need to do with the software? That's usage scenario-based testing. I like to start off user scenarios testing by creating a visualization of the users with, naturally, as you might have guessed, a mind map is one of my favorite things, although you could do this with a word processor document or with any form of spreadsheet or something, or outlining tool. I like a mind map. I like to share this with my team. I like to make sure that we're all in sync on who the users are and what are their primary jobs, and to model them and to make sure we've got them all listed somewhere so that we can sort of be aware of them and be sensitive to them. Maybe even we can invent personas of users doing these things and try to sort of put ourselves in their shoes while we're working on the software. Now, in this case, for the fictitious chocolate wrapping device I talk about, the Wrap-O-Matic, the users might be the operator. The operator monitors the status and enters manifests of the Wrap-O-Matic to make sure it's up and running and to make sure a batch is ready to start. An auditor would be a user who audits the system. They're not actually operating it, but what they'll do is they'll look at reporting of it and compare it to actuals. So an auditor's job is to say, does the reporting match the reality? And their job is to identify and report any discrepancies, or to show with some sort of statistical confidence that there's consistency. That's the auditor. Then the loader is someone who loads materials into the Wrap-O-Matic. So the loader loads papers, chocolates, ribbons, boxes, wrapping materials, etc. That's the loader. The unloader removes things. So the loader puts things, the unloader removes things. It's interesting because they're two different roles. The loader's skill set is different from the unloader's skill set. So they can be separated. And the unloader removes boxed and rejected chocolates. It's sort of basically like the person who takes the boxed chocolates and puts it on the truck to ship it. There's a role called a health inspector who basically doesn't really do much with the Wrap-O-Matic except samples the chocolates to make sure they haven't been contaminated, that the ingredients match the labels, and that there's maybe no peanuts. This is a health inspection. Again, this is basically related to sampling. So the health inspector samples the Wrap-O-Matic production. And then there's the person who maintains it, the maintainer, that does repairs, maintenance, updates, upgrades, cleaning, that sort of stuff. So there's basically a blend of mechanical and electronic and software type of things going on in maintenance of the Wrap-O-Matic. But in all, we have to take a look when we're looking at this, at all these type of users. And the question you might ask yourself is, if we're making a new release of the product, can these users do their jobs? So can they do their jobs? And that becomes usage scenario-based tests. In fact, each type of job may have one or more tests associated with it. So making mind maps of the users could be a very low-tech thing. I like the idea of having like a whiteboard somewhere marked "Do not erase" clearly on it, and having people basically use that as a guide to who the users are and what do they do. And you can even take a look at what they do and maybe even break it down further to refine that down to maybe the task level. One interesting method to describe usage scenarios is to use what's called a storyboard. Storyboards have been popularized in the entertainment industry for years. It's also popular in product marketing. People create a sort of story of a life of someone, or a journey of someone through their relationship with the product, and they like to describe these in storyboards. Storyboards, the style that I've learned to use is the style of the American comic book. So I take an American comic book like Batman or Superman or Archie or whatever one you like, Richie Rich, it doesn't matter what comic you like, but you look at, there's a form to it. And a page in the comic book has basically some characteristics, right? There's basically between 1 and maybe 6 frames, a little more in some comic books. Certainly the European style has a lot more frames and much smaller print. The American one is bigger print, fewer frames. I lean towards that. So maybe 6 frames on a page the most, but it's sometimes 1 or 2. And each frame has the possibility of a little bit of text on the bottom of it. That's context text. Like it might say it was the next morning, or there was a loud bang, or something like that. And then in the frame itself, you'll see characters interacting with each other with text in call-out boxes, basically bubbles that have the text for the dialogue between the characters. Remarkably, they're drawn in such a way that you as a human being can actually tell the natural order. It usually is top down, left to right, but it's amazingly intuitive how to read a comic book. So you don't have to actually say, I wonder who spoke first, and get confused about that. It sort of flows very naturally. And it's basically then tells a story. You can tell a very, very complex narrative in very few pages, maybe 5 or 6 pages, and you can tell a very complex narrative, which in the form of a short story may require much longer to write. So it's an interesting narrative style that's very terse, but really makes the point. And then each frame basically is separated from the precedent frame to advance the story. It's advancing the plot. So the connection between the frames is to advance the plot. By the end, you've heard a story from beginning to end. It's one story. It's not every possible story. It's not every possible outcome, right? It's one story. And so that's what I like to do with usage scenarios here, model with a storyboard to create a story from beginning to end. And I do this usually by interviewing people and ask them to describe to me their real job. Tell me the story of your real job. It's very hard because people sometimes don't know how to naturally describe what their real job is. So instead, I ask them instead, what did you do at work? And they may have trouble doing that. So I'll say, okay, well, last Thursday, when you went into work, did you get a cup of coffee? And what happened next? And they eventually, you can get people to tell you a story of what they actually did at work. And then what I will do is I will usually create a mind map of some of it, but I will then visualize it. I will make a storyboard. I'll make a storyboard. And of course, I'm not a very good artist, so I'm going to use just stick figures, but I'll make a storyboard. And then what I will do is I will review the storyboard with the person I'm interviewing. I'm going to review it with them, and I will basically learn from them. Did I miss something? Was there a step extra that I put in there? Do I have the right order of operations? Did I capture? And I try to capture as much as possible every point where the user makes a decision or enters some sort of information or uses some information. So enter data, use data, or make a decision are the key points. And I certainly want each frame to at least have that sort of distinction between them. It's not just time, it's events that trigger transitions. Now, the style I like to use is, as I said, the American comic book style. As I said, I personally am not very artistic, so I use stick figures. That's all. I don't need to have artistic systems. I just need stick figures, a little bit of text on the bottom of each frame, and then from one frame to the other, I will show with arrows and maybe blocks the interaction between things, and I will try to also identify for each frame, was there data in that frame? Here's an example of one that was drawn up by my daughter about Fred buying a book on Amazon.com. So in the first frame, if I can just move my picture out here, the first frame, Fred has the idea of the book that he wants to get. So he knows the book and he knows information about the book, he wants to get it. Then he moves on, goes to his computer, goes to the right website, in this case it's Amazon.com, searches for the book, and in this case it's with an ISBN number. So you see the next frame is selecting the book, putting it in the shopping cart, then checking out. Logging in takes place after you check out or as part of the checkout process. Make sure he's got the right shipping information entered there. And then in the end, he actually gets the book delivered. So it's from, the concept is from when I came up with the idea with the book till when I get it delivered. So we're modeling the whole experience from beginning to end. And we have information in there about where there was data entered. So there was data entered a couple of places. There's the URL to go to Amazon. There's the search criteria for the book. There's the order volume and selection for the shopping cart. There's the payment method for the shopping cart. Then there's the credentials for logging in and the demographics for shipment. So all of that stuff, and of course, the arrival of the book, but all of that stuff takes place in that sequence. That's a story, it's an example, and it's basically a description of a specific usage scenario. So storyboards for me is a beautiful visual way to describe it, especially when you want feedback from users to say, hey, do I get this right? Is this okay? So this is basically an example I'll show you of a storyboard that I made when I interviewed my granddaughter, Eva. At the time she did this, she was 11 years old. Now she's a university student at our neighboring English University, Concordia, but she lives actually in Alberta and is taking this virtual semester living or working at home from Alberta, so doesn't have to travel to Montreal. Saves her a lot of money on rent, this virtual stuff. But she's there, and she basically tried to explain to me social networking. So she basically took some time and tried to explain to me. I interviewed her, and I learned from her a few things. Like I learned from her, who are the users and what do they do on social networking? So there was I learned that there was end users that have status, and they update or comment on status, and they post things like pictures and photos and objects. And the objects can be all sorts of different things. And they comment on posts and approve things, get private messages, notifications from third-party applications, and manage collections of people that they communicate with, which are groups, what they call groups of friends. So there's interesting stuff that's going on in the social networking world. I am not comfortable in the world of social networking. I don't know how to use Facebook. I have an account to look at pictures of my grandchildren, but I hardly use that at all. And it's not for me. I'm not a big fan of that. And by the way, I also learned that there was a user, other than the end user, there was like processes which basically send messages and do direct marketing and stuff like that. All right, so I interviewed Eva. I tried to find out how can I share a picture with social networking software. This was actually with Facebook at the time. So how do I share a picture? And so she showed me how to share a picture. And she explained it to me in her own vocabulary. This is my storyboard I put together. You'll notice it's simple stick figures and blocks. There's nothing much in there. The first step was to find out about images. So I had, let's say, for example, images were in a digital camera at the time. So I want to basically get a list of images from different sources. So the sources is a variable here. And the sources could be local files, cameras, phones, memory cards, USB sticks, all that type of stuff is where the source of images could be. Then I get that list of images, and the list I get then has different characteristics, like different image format. Perhaps some of them are GIF files, some of them are JPEG files, some of them are PNG files, different formats, in different resolutions, with different sizes, colors, and all sorts of attributes. And maybe even there's no images in the source, so there might be a count of none, or there might be a count of many. And this is what the list of images is. And then we have to look and find out who we're going to send it to. So we want to get from Facebook categories we've already put together, names of groups, names of communities that could be private or public. So it could be I want to post it to a public group or a private group. So all right, so I'm looking at this stuff, and you'll notice there's nothing in this that's talking about specifically what the user interface is. I'm not looking at how I navigate through the system. I'm not trying to write a click here, click there to-do list. I'm trying to just understand the interactions with the system without being specific to the design of the system. Get the list of groups of friends, and I could have none, many, one, whatever. I have lists. I probably have only one because I only have one person who's a friend in there, my wife, Anne. Then once I've got that list of images, I want to pick what is the image I'd like to share. And this could be, I guess, one or more image, but then I select by name type or preview, something like that. So I pick the image. And once I've got the image, I pick the group of people to send it to. And usually you have to check the group by either name, membership, or you make a custom group just for this picture. And then we post it to the group. So I've got the group, I got the picture, I post it. And I could do one or more images to one or more groups. Bang, magical, wonderful. It goes out there. And then I tag it. This is the part that I was really confused about. What was this tagging thing? And apparently there's all sorts of tagging that you can do about where you are, what you're doing, who's in the picture, etc. And there's even some AI code apparently that can recognize the same picture or the same face in different pictures, so that it can sort of give you some hints as to who's in what picture. Pretty neat ideas, pretty neat stuff. And this is what I learned to do. And I learned it by interviewing Eva, and I showed her my storyboard, which was really sloppy, and she confirmed most of it, but some of it she didn't sort of like, and so I had to tweak it and adjust it. And then I had the unique opportunity of going down to Mountain View, California, to the offices of Facebook. And I actually took my storyboards with me and my story of Eva explaining to me how the scenario worked. I wanted to show them the storyboard model and how it can be used in great test design over there. I was there for other reasons. I was there mostly for performance testing stuff. But Facebook is a huge company, probably the biggest software engineering scalability problem on the planet. And I was down there and I showed to the stakeholders in the performance testing group what I'd done. And they all looked at me and said, Rob, how could you do that? And I said, what do you mean? Well, they said, 11-year-olds aren't allowed to have accounts on Facebook. And I said, what? 11-year-olds are not allowed to have accounts on Facebook? How come my granddaughter, who's 11 years old, has an account on Facebook then? And I said, oh, I don't know. And I said, how do you check that they have, that they're 8 years old? Do you ask for a credit card? Do you ask for authentication from a parent? Well, how do you know that their age and all that? And they said it's basically just voluntary. So apparently, the people who are under whatever the age was, 19 or whatever, who apply for Facebook accounts are all pretty much lying about their age and who they are. And this gets into all sorts of ethical concerns. But I learned about that the hard way, really. They loved the storyboard. They didn't like the fact that my granddaughter was using Facebook. And that's such is life. That's what happened at the time. Now, once I've got the storyboard to create a test on it, I'm actually going to then try to, in some cases, I try to make an automation of this where I will go through and I'll go through all of the steps with all of the variables identified, and I will what's called parameterize the user experience. And I will basically repeat the scenario multiple times with different data for each of the variables. So the test is always from beginning to end, do the scenario, but I vary the parameterized data each time, and I may create variants of the scenario for error conditions, or I may not. It's really depending what I'm trying to do. I love to exercise variability and valid options, so as much variability as I can, and then the error conditions maybe one at a time to see how that works out. And I may well test the error conditions without having to go through the whole scenario every time. But I love this. Usage scenario tests have helped me a lot in my career. So the trick is storyboard the experience, somehow visualize it, get feedback from the user community that what you're doing is correct or is reasonable representation of their modeling their job. Remember, you're modeling what the user is doing, not what the software is doing. We're modeling the usage of it. And we parameterize that as we're collecting it. We identify points of decision. We identify data that's being entered. We identify information that's coming out. And those are the points that we want to capture as variables along the way. We want the frames to be probably delineated by points where people enter data or make decisions or use data as much as we can. And then we basically repeat the scenario from end to end with a pre-selected output input for each case. And always run the tests as if it was a user experience, which means also, though, that when you get to a page that has an option you haven't tested, if that option is not in the scenario, you just leave it alone. Like you're really focused only on what's the minimum number of things the user needs to do to get their job done. There's other types of testing to complement this. You could do what I would call is like fuzz testing or Turing exploratory testing around these scenarios. You might also have a test where you say, okay, let's do a typical user scenario, but imagine the user's distracted, and every single time there's some distraction, the user gets carried away by the distraction and then comes back to continue the scenario. So that's sort of user experience testing that can give you nice charters for exploratory testing. Some people use the term TOFT, T-O-F-T. That's task-oriented functional testing, TOFT. So it's just a term that's used to describe the type of testing we're doing, scenario-based testing. They just say they're task-oriented because they're challenging. Can the user accomplish a useful task correctly with the software that we're testing? So that's where they say task-oriented functional testing. All right, so thank you very, very much.